Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. Today, as you may notice, this weekly review is a little early, and that's partly because of some very exciting things, but that is mostly that I'm part of a book tour for the wonderful I'm Not Raymond Wallace by Sam Kenyon, and the dates for that are sort of fall on this coming Sunday, which is when I would normally have my weekly reviews, and another video next week as well. And so I thought, rather than skipping a weekly review, I may as well just put it a little earlier. Hope you don't mind. Anyway, that's enough ramble about all of that. Let's get on to the books that I read this week. So I've struggled a little bit with reading this week. I think partly I've just been pretty tired, and so most of the books I'm talking about today are audiobooks. There are a couple I actually managed to read in person, not physically, but it's been an interesting week. I've been on a lot of bus journeys, which has been mostly great for reading. And then the rest of my time I've been, I don't know, my brain's been absolute mush. But I have read some lovely books this week, and I will go on to talk a little bit more about them. So the first one, I've already covered in last week's weekly review in some ways, but Édouard Louis, who I mentioned in a specific video on, this sounds incredibly pretentious to now say, I tried reading his book, Who Killed My Father, in the original French. And I don't know if it was something about rereading it, or something about reading it in the original French, or because I was incredibly tired that day. I found this really incredibly impactful on the second read. And the book itself, I sort of spoke about before, so I'll sort of just cover very quickly here. The book itself talks about Édouard Louis' relationship with his father, and particularly framing this whole sort of thing around where his father's life kind of became quite complicated. So various complications around being a working class man, around various perceptions of how to be a man, about having a father himself who was quite abusive and quite violent, and then the sort of political circumstances that impact that. And so as a result, this book kind of feels like an examination of his father through these sort of multiple lenses. And something that I found really interesting, and I think probably enjoyed more so on the second read, was a little bit more about where his father had come from and how that sort of shaped him. So he talks about how violence only leads to more violence, and so his father purposely was, would not hit the children, or was very, very conscious about all of those things. But he still had forms of violence in other ways. He was kind of quite physically, quite an imposing man. He would shout quite a lot. And so actually, even though he didn't hit anybody, there was another form of violence almost that kind of came from that. And part of the book also looks at this idea of, when we tell a biography of people, we never mention political characters. So we don't say, for example, the policies of Sarkozy or Chirac had an impact on my father. And he does that. He names and shames politicians and says, your policies actively made my dad's health worse, or meant that he could get less support. And I found it really powerful on a reread, kind of having that moment. So really, really interesting, gorgeous book in both English and French, apparently. My French is also not perfect at all, so there's probably a lot where I've been like, yes, there's probably something else going on under the surface that's really clever that I've missed. But regardless, a really interesting book. Next up, on a very, very different note, I read Porn, An Oral History by Polly Barton, published by Fitzcarraldo Press, and it's coming out next year. On one of those bus journeys that I was talking about, the long bus journeys, I had these books with me that I was going to read, and then because it's winter and I didn't really think this through, it got incredibly dark on the journey, and so the lighting in the bus would have meant it was really hard to read physically. And so I turned to my Kindle, and what did I have there? This book. And so I thought I'd check this out. But it comes out next year. And this book I just found really interesting for how it examined what's often quite a tricky topic. So it talks about porn, as you'd guess from the title, but what it is really is Polly Barton talking to, I think, 13 or 14 of her friends, and having in-depth conversations with them about their relationships with sex, sexuality, porn, so many other things. And in these conversations around porn, it's, not only what do you think about it, is it good or bad, is often these really in-depth conversations about the line for people between reality and fantasy, or between kind of mindful consumption and addiction. And she goes into all of these really interesting conversations where nobody really has a distinct opinion of, yes, this is the best thing ever, or this is the worst thing ever and we should ban it. Everything's sort of in this grey area in the middle, and it's a really interesting book for that, to have these very in-depth discussions about something so at times taboo but also so complicated. It's nuanced. Polly Barton's own thoughts are kind of echoed in the book as well. We see her responses to her interviewees, and sometimes she's saying, well, yeah, that's the thing I struggle with, because I find it really difficult to know if that is a societal thing that we're seeing reflected in porn, or whether porn is shaping society, or both things can be true at the same time, or everything and everything. And I just found it a really interesting book. I think it's well worth checking out, and I think very true to Fitzcarraldo is also just one of those books where it's just a good thinking kind of book, where you just get to sit and really delve into a subject and think about it a little bit, and I found that really quite engaging. Next up, I read Frozen Woman by Annie Ernaux, and I mean, with November being as it was, this is one of the books that I was really keen to check out. And I must admit, when I first started this book, I wasn't fully sure on it. I was kind of not quite sure how I would find a hook into the book in some ways. But actually, I found it really quite profound by the end. This is Annie Ernaux talking about various things, but particularly being a woman and being a mother, and the expectations on both. So she talks about how there are these wildly uneven roles, at least expectations of roles between men and women, which, you know, is a topic obviously many people have spoken about before, and there are some really interesting books written about it, but really fun to get Annie Ernaux's perspective. That she talks about how, you know, she sort of starts off as this very much like, I can do everything kind of woman, and then she realizes this is not really possible, and that turns into some resentment to some of the men around her that they don't have to do this. She talks at one point about going to the supermarket and almost being overwhelmed with being like, well, I've got to get this thing, and then I need to go and do that thing, and then I need to go and pick up this other thing, and while I'm doing that, I'm also juggling thinking about getting some more nappies for the future, and oh, this is a good deal, should we stock up now, but do we have money? And all of these sort of really in-depth discussions and things with herself, and she then sees how the men around her don't really seem to be having any of those conversations at all, and this mental load of being a woman is such a big thing here. And she also then sort of internalizes that in terms of how she sees motherhood. Is she going to be a good mother? Is she a terrible mother? You know, all of those sorts of things. And it's just really interesting in a very Ernaux kind of way. Of it's just this spooling narrative of who she is, and yet it has this kind of cohesive thread that ties it all together. And so I do recommend this one. I think it's one of her longer books, still not massively long, but one of her longer ones, as in like the audiobook was 5 hours instead of like 2, but a really interesting book, and yeah, was really glad to have checked it out. And last but not least, we have Super Infinite, The Transformations of John Donne by Katherine Rundell, and this book won the Baillie Gifford Prize recently, a non-fiction book prize, and you know how I love prizes, but I think a part that makes a lot of sense within that is the Baillie Gifford, normally when it's talking about you know, comparing non-fiction books to each other, the thing it's really looking for a lot of the time is how those books are able to tell a narrative. So it's not just, I've done my research and here's all the research and isn't that interesting, but how does it build a full narrative in what it's talking about, whatever the subject matter. And that's something that I think is so true about this book. I found it really beautiful and did not expect it to do what it did. It's a book telling the life story of John Donne, a poet who I know very little about, apart from having studied one of his poems at school, The Flea. And so it's very, very weird to look at and learn a little bit more about his life. But also, there's something about the magic of this book. It's so powerfully written that I was just completely sucked in to its world, really. So it starts really right from the beginning about looking at John Donne as this man who had a really complicated life at times. The book opens even with talking about him writing a book all about suicide and about wanting to die. And then as we go through this book, we learn little bits about his sort of upbringing and his impact on literature and his impact on writing. And I don't think it matters if you know anything about John Donne or not for this book. I still found it deeply, deeply intriguing to learn about this very complicated man who has this relationship as being this man who's a bit of an outsider and quite relishes this idea of sort of sticking two fingers up to the system, but is also operating within a system where you can't really do that safely, and so is also very much operating within it, and is also quite religious, but is also on the outskirts of some of those parts of religion, but then also becomes a preacher. He's just this real interesting kind of complexity of a human. And I think what's incredibly well done here is that Katherine Rundell is able to keep this book moving along. That this could have easily been 1,000 pages of just, and then John Donne did this thing. And I think instead it feels like a compelling narrative telling his story and giving us a bit more information about who this man was. And in the meantime also is a bit of an interesting exploration of what is, you know, religion and writing and being an outcast. What are all these things all about? It's a glorious, glorious book. I heard an interview with her, with Katherine Rundell, after she won the Baillie Gifford, and she spoke about how an inspiration of hers was Hilary Mantel, and Hilary Mantel spoke about how a masterpiece of a book is mostly a masterpiece of editing. You know, what do you take out to make a book work? And Katherine Rundell spent about 10 years living in the world of writing this book and kind of, you know, learning about John Donne, and has created a book that I think she's very carefully edited down to work and to only really say the key details. And I think it works for that reason. There's a real story here, and Katherine Rundell, I think, has done something really quite profound to work out who he is and set it within something that makes entire sense. And we also get little bits of his poetry in the book as well, which gave me a brand new appreciation for him. I hadn't really thought about him since The Flea. Yeah, really, really interesting book. And that takes me to the end of the books I've read this week. A bit shorter, partly because I'm filming it earlier, partly because reading's not really been a thing this week as much. Most of the, you know, a few of these books are audiobooks. Anyway, I've had a good reading week regardless. I hope everyone's doing really, really well, and I will see you back soon for another video. I hope you're keeping well. Take care. Bye-bye.